What's the Christ-like way to kill an animal?
I think probably the way that I do it.
Could I read an excerpt about how you do it that you've put it in your book here?
Sure. For you to use those words that are so meaningful to me and to throw them back at me in the way the way that you read them without feeling, it is so disingenuous to argue that because you don't eat meat anymore that suddenly you're not responsible for the death of animals.
I never said that.
Like, you are condemning over 1 billion people who raise livestock, people in poor villages all over the world who raise livestock for their own family. Yes, I would do that.
I'm not condemning the people, I'm condemning the action.
Condemning them.
So why do you think the hunter got so angry and emotional when you read out his own words that he wrote in his own book?
Yeah, that's a wild one. I want to start by saying,
hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we've got a fiery debate that could shake up your beliefs. Kameron Waters, a Christian vegan filmmaker, just faced off against Tony Jones, a Christian reverend and hunter. And it got intense. Kameron is the co-director of the new film Christspiracy, looking at animals and religion, and Tony hosts his own podcast called The Reverend Hunter. He's also just written a book where he goes into detail about how much he loves hunting and killing animals. They were debating the question, was Jesus actually a vegan? It was about 3 hours of heated discussion, and in a dramatic twist right at the end, Tony the Hunter got pretty upset and a little bit angry. I've sifted through the chaos to bring you the bits that I think are the most interesting from this debate, and I'm going to be giving my reactions to each of these segments. But that's not all. Tony the Hunter was given an extra segment at the end of the debate because of how upset he was in the original debate. Do you think it was fair that Tony got to come back and say stuff when Kameron the vegan had already left? So stick around, because after we dive into this fierce exchange, I've got Kameron Waters here on the channel to give us his final thoughts and have his final say on this debate. Hit that like button if you're ready to start. Let's dive in.
I mean, my position on ethics of eating animals, I'm a hunter. I eat meat, mostly meat that I take from animals that I kill while I'm hunting. I'm very committed to that. I have thought a ton about the ethics of that. It's one of the things I love about hunting, frankly. Hunters think and talk about the ethics of taking an animal a lot, more than probably the person at the supermarket does.
Let's talk about some real life examples that challenge the claim that hunters care more about animals than everyone else. First, there's a Stained singer, Aaron Lewis, who made headlines for spelling out Trump 24 with the bodies of dead coyotes that he'd hunted. This isn't about conservation or respect for animals. It's a political statement using dead wildlife. Then there's a story of a hunter who shot a deer and left them to suffer overnight. The poor animal had to be euthanized the following day. Can you imagine being left to die like that? And just last October, another hunter left a shot deer alive for an entire hour before killing them, posing for photos and making a mockery of this deer. And these are just the stories that made it to me. Imagine how many similar incidents go unheard and unreported. Now I can already hear the hunter's rebuttal. Well, they're not real hunters. Real hunters would never do anything like that. I'd never do anything like that. But that's just dodging the issue. The core problem is the inherent violence in hunting. Whether it's fast violence or slow violence, it's violence to animals. It's not just about a few bad apples. It's about the entire practice. It's time we face the reality of what hunting really means for animals.
The way that I hunt and butcher animals, I'm very deliberate and frankly quite spiritual about it. I have found the process of being involved in the killing and butchering of animals to be deeply meaningful to me, and in fact helping me get through like really hard times in my life.
Let's break that down. Essentially what he's saying is he's killing animals because it makes him feel good. And I find that shocking. There are countless ways to cope with difficult emotions and trauma that don't involve going out and hunting down innocent animals. Exercise, meditation, therapy, connecting with loved ones, getting hobbies that don't involve stabbing animals in the neck. I mean, the list goes on. Relying on violence to feel better not only raises ethical questions, but also suggests a much deeper issue. He needs to ask himself why he feels that it's okay to use another animal's suffering to help him with his own well-being.
Whether it's like purely biological, evolutionary, that's what we've been doing, or in the Bible, throughout the Bible, like well, that's what people did. They ate, or in virtually any religion, like this is how people do it in any society, in any culture. Like we eat animals. The vast majority of human beings eat animals. And there's a reason that we do it. I mean, I think there are evolutionary reasons. And you can, even if you're a non-religious person, I think you could understand why that happened the way it did. Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of things that we have done in the past that we don't do anymore, that were a part of our survival, but we realized at a certain point that they were deeply unethical and quite frankly unnecessary. So how is this any different?
Well, it is. I think it's different. You're right. There are things, and the Bible has this, it's something that I think was in one of your questions that maybe we didn't get to, but there's these trajectories in scripture of like trajectory of more rights for women. So I do think ethics changes, but of course there's all sorts of stuff that's never even mentioned in scripture that we have to doesn't say whether you should drive the speed limit. These are things we have to make ad hoc determinations as Christians, ethical Christians who live in the real world. We have to make these decisions because all sorts of stuff confronts us. The short answer is yes. I do think ethics, you could call it evolve, but I more think of it like, new things are constantly coming up.
So he doesn't really answer the question about animals, but at least he acknowledges that ethics can and do change. But if you recognize that ethics evolve, why not evolve and stop going out and shooting animals or paying people to farm, mutilate, and kill them in farms and slaughterhouses? We've seen other societal shifts in things like human rights, environmentalism. The treatment of animals deserves the same consideration. Protecting animals is obviously about animals, but it's also about us growing and becoming better as a society. It's about evolving our actions to align with our evolving ethics.
Is it possible that having compassion towards animals who are feeling and sentient could be that next step?
I think I do have compassion for animals, but I'll just give you a for instance, is that in the state of Minnesota where I live, there's a thing called chronic wasting disease. It's the equivalent of mad cow disease in deer. It's always fatal. The wildlife biologists in the state of Minnesota say we need to kill more deer. And so I guess I'd say an ethical solution when the wildlife biologists at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources say there's too many deer, they're spreading disease, we need to thin the herd, then I think hunting, frankly, is a very ethical way. We're living in a situation where the wolves aren't going to come back. I wish they were, but they're not because we've left no room for them. So
there are parts of the world where humans are dying of starvation, thirst, disease, and worse every minute of every day. If Tony, the compassionate Reverend, is so eager to control populations for their own good, would he sign up to help control human populations under the same rationale if biologists told him that it was a good thing to do? Of course not. He'd go out and find funding and look for non-violent solutions, technological solutions to the problem. He'd do what many human rights charities are already doing. He would never go out, pick up a rifle, and start mowing down people. True compassion means finding humane solutions to these issues, to address the root causes without causing more harm to animals. It means looking beyond the rifle and looking for ways that we can coexist.
Where does kindness, compassion, love, and mercy for everything God created come into play when killing animals who are sentient beings that feel pain and who are hardwired to survive just like humans?
Mm-hmm. Can you provide a definition of sentient?
We know that there's a difference between like a plant versus an animal that has a thinking, feeling brain.
I mean, I think we're learning a lot more about like the interconnectedness of plants and that plants do actually have like some kind of sense. We have to draw the line somewhere, and anywhere we draw it is arbitrary. And
really?
Yes, except after humans, because humans have, as far as we can tell, yes, I think other animals have consciousness, and some other animals even, sentience, yes. So sentience sometimes is defined as like the ability to feel pain or something like that. But again, that becomes very tricky too, or they have a brain, but then you would ask the question of like, a single ant probably doesn't have sentience, but you'd be like, does a colony of ants? The only place that it makes any sense to draw the line is beneath humans, which is hard because we love dogs and we love cats and we love seeing birds fly around. As far as we know, none of those animals has any kind of first-person experience. They can't, for instance, contemplate their own existence, or they can't think, I wonder how I will die. That's not their experience of life. They can't think about what they did yesterday. They can't contemplate the future. Only humans can do that.
What is it about our kind that allows us to have that that treatment as opposed to and differentiates our ability to treat animals in a different way?
Our brains. It's our brains.
What about our brains?
They're better. They're better than all the other brains on this planet.
So, according to Tony, the Reverend Hunter, the only thing that could save these animals from his rifle is if the animal had this one specific quality, the ability to think about the past and the future. Oh, and it just so happens that Tony is a human, a member of a species that has this. What a strange coincidence. Why didn't he put more emphasis on eyesight, for example, something that many animals are better at than us? Or strength, something that many animals surpasses in also. It's like a bodybuilder coming over and saying, hey, I value life based on bench presses. If you can bench press over 100 kilos, then you're cool. You got my protection. You're in my group. But if you can't, that means I can farm and kill you. What the Reverend is saying is just as silly as that. Basing the value of life on one human trait to justify hunting and killing animals is not only convenient, but it's also incredibly flawed.
If a house is burning, there's a human and a dog, and you run in, you have time to save one, you'll save... Virtually every human being will save the human.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, because we live in this kind of moral hierarchy. Those animals are sub-moral. There's no morality in dogs. I love my dog, trust me. And I said in my book, I'm not going to eat my dog. But that's like a choice I've made. In other cultures, people do eat dogs, but I choose not to. And I also choose, not to eat other animals, and I choose to eat some animals and not others. So I think it's possible to have compassion for other animals that are sub-moral.
So Tony the Hunter says that if a house is burning, you would obviously save the human and not the dog. And somehow that means that it's okay to go out and shoot animals in the woods. That doesn't really make sense. Just because you might save a human first doesn't mean it's fine to kill animals for fun or food. When you have the choice to eat plant-based foods, but you choose to hunt down animals instead, you're doing it because you like it, not because you need to. That's never going to be compassionate. Killing animals can't be a compassionate act if you're doing it for fun. And that's what most hunters and meat eaters are doing. They're killing animals for their own enjoyment, for taste, or for the thrill of shooting them.
You're calling them sub-moral. So is there a possibility where there can be a human being that's sub-moral that doesn't have certain cognitive ability to process?
Definitely. But the difference is for that's a great question, because of course there are people who've had brain injuries or birth defects or something, so they don't have, but because they're of our same kind, they have the potential, or they had the potential for that a moral life. So they're included in the protection that we provide for human beings and we don't provide for dogs. The norm is a better brain. The norm is what you would call a first person experience. You have an experience of yourself. You can drive home from this conversation reflecting, this is called second order discourse. Like what we're doing here is first order discourse. And I'm going to fly home on the plane tonight and be like, oh, I should have said this. And as far as we can tell, there's no ape and there's no dolphin that like is thinking like, oh, when I threw that poop at that other ape yesterday, I shouldn't have done that.
Right, but
we have moral reasoning. So the people, the very small minority of Homo sapiens sapiens who don't have that ability, we include them in our kind because they are Homo sapiens sapiens, even if by some anomaly they're in a philosophical sense disordered and not able to sit and have a debate.
This idea about in-groups and out-groups, it's based on genetics. He's basically saying if you have the right genetics, then you'll be protected. Even if you're disabled, as long as you have that human DNA, you're all good. But if you're a deer, well, unlucky. You don't have the right genetics. You don't have that human DNA. So that means I get to shoot you. If only you had that human DNA, I would have protected you then. There's a famously evil man from history who also decided who lived and who died based on genetics. I'll let you figure out who that guy was. This is not compassionate or Christian logic. It's horrible.
How does having another being that just isn't classified in our kind, what about that justifies abusing and killing them, especially if it's not necessary?
I don't think anything, I mean, I would never advocate for abusing an animal. but I would advocate for killing animals.
Let's think about what abuse means. It's defined as cruel and violent treatment towards a human or animal. So he's saying that shooting animals and tearing them to pieces isn't cruel or violent. I think the animals would strongly disagree. And so do I. Now things are about to get really uncomfortable and awkward when Kameron the vegan starts reading the hunter's own words from his own book, which surprisingly really upsets the hunter.
How would Jesus kill an animal? What's the spiritual way to kill an animal?
I don't know how Jesus would kill an animal. I can't answer that.
You don't know how Jesus would. Do you believe Jesus killed animals?
Oh, I have no idea. What I don't do is speculate about stuff that's not in the text.
What's the Christ-like way to kill an animal?
I think probably the way that I do it.
Could I read an excerpt about how you do it? That
you
you've
want.
put it
I
in
mean,
your that you put
if
in
you wanna
your
promote my
book here.
Sure.
A deer doesn't have front shoulder joints. It's odd. The humerus doesn't connect with the scapula in a socket like it does in the back hips or in human shoulders, for that matter. Instead, it's connective tissue, cartilage, and silver skin. They bridge the opposing muscles like layered sheets of paper, allowing the leg to pivot without a fulcrum. Separating the front leg from the rest of the deer resides in my imagination as pure sense memory. Skinned and hung for a couple of days, the doe has taken on a darkened hue, her muscles moisture wicked away by the cold November wind. I prefer to hang a deer by the head, but for the purpose of carving off a front leg. Hanging by a gramble through its backward-facing knees is better. Hoisting her onto the tailgate of a pickup works too. Press the rigor mortised. I don't even know. That's some heavy vocabulary. Mortised leg out on a slide a sharp knife in. Gentle strokes, lightly touched. The blade glides between the muscles as if connecting the cartilage. As if the connecting cartilage is pulling the blade, welcoming the cuts, inviting the separation. A light crackle sounds as the slightly frozen tissue tears ahead of the knife. I slice, I push the leg away, my hand around her ankle. The rift continues. And I can read more, but what about that description is the Christ-like way?
Man, that is what you just read is among the most meaningful, sacred words that I've ever put on paper. And I've had multiple people, my book came out a week ago, and I've had multiple people in tears tell me that was the most meaningful chapter to them. I mean, it's a little, for you to use those words that are so meaningful to me and to throw them back at me in the way the way that you read them without feeling is...
Oh, I feel them.
I really think that's low.
I feel them.
That chapter to me is probably that chapter and the chapter about my father's death are the most meaningful chapters of the most meaningful book I've ever written. Yeah.
As you can see, Tony the Hunter gets visibly emotional and defensive when Kameron starts reading out this part of his book where he's vividly and graphically describing how he hunted and butchered a deer. He seems really attached to his new hobby of chasing down and gutting innocent animals, but expecting empathy for that level of violence is delusional, especially expecting empathy from a vegan who is opposed to everything that you're saying. I mean, sure, we can empathize with the fact that Tony has been through tough times. We've all been through tough times. But going through tough times doesn't give you the green light to go and create extremely tough times for other animals. You don't get to play the victim while you victimize others. Why not just take up carpentry, build a few chairs, or better yet, go out hunting, but just switch the rifle for a camera?
I personally feel that you can go to the woods and learn about God without having to, kill another being, especially in that type of way. And I am curious how that type of way is reflective of a Christ-like way or a way that brings you closer to God. But I have we all have our traumas. My brother was murdered last year. And what I've learned through that process, I don't see that line. I see when a deer is out there having fun, enjoying its life like we cover in the film. And I know you saw the film. We have a young boy from my own Christian hunting club that I was a part of that shot a deer and clearly displays on camera the guilt complex and the process of going through that and not feeling good about it and realizing that I went through that too. Because similar to the way that I lost my brother because he was shot, hunted, basically, not only do I have the grief of witnessing what's happened to my brother, but I have the grief of witnessing what's happening to my mother, who doesn't have a son anymore. And that deer has a mother. And we know, and we've seen that these animals, when they lose their kin, they look for them. We know that dairy cows, when the cow's taken away so that the baby cow doesn't take the mother's meat or milk, we know that the cows scream and they want their children back. I would love to pose a challenge to you, and we can continue this. Rather than go out into the woods and shoot a deer from however far away with a rifle, either A, go kill the deer with a knife or your hands, or B, better yet, let's get 2 baby ducklings. Let's have you raise the 2 baby ducklings yourself. Because I don't know, I haven't read through everything, but I can't see anywhere where you actually raised an animal to eat it. But let's raise 2 baby ducklings from their first birth until the age of maturation that they need to be killed. And I would love to follow you on that journey of raising 2 baby ducklings, having them at your house, and then eventually having to kill them.
Why don't you go ahead
I
then?
don't want to swear on your podcast, but to do that, like 2 baby ducklings, like, no, dude, you're like, that's my life in that book. And you're using that as a fulcrum to try to win
I'm not trying to win.
No, you're trying to win over people's affections by like, yes, I would, like billions of human beings do on this planet, raise livestock and butcher them and eat them. Like, you are condemning over 1 billion people who raise livestock, people in poor villages all over the world who raise livestock for their own family. Yes, I would do that.
I'm not condemning the people.
You
I'm condemning
are
the action.
condemning them.
No, I'm
You
not. I'm
are.
condemning the action.
And now Tony the Hunter seems to have lost his temper, resorting to the age-old, what about the poor people, you're condemning poor people, anti-vegan argument, something that vegans deal with all the time. How dare you condemn poor people? They're just trying to survive. Vegans are terrible, elitist, etc., etc. Yet here he is, Tony the Hunter, sat on a podcast in a podcast studio, air-conditioned, after he flew in specifically for this, a man that gets paid to write books and run his own podcast. And he's using poor people as an excuse for his violent behavior to animals. Instead of addressing these points that Kameron made, he chooses to hide behind poor people and prop up the struggles of poor people doing whatever they need to do to survive, to try and attempt to justify killing animals for his hobby and his own enjoyment. Let's not deflect from the real issue here, mate. The hunter has all the means to choose a vegan lifestyle, but he chooses not to.
I think it's all pure intentions with your heart. And you didn't receive that last thing very well. And I know that you both went through something really difficult by even just listening to that, and through the loss of your brother. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that too. I wish we just could have talked about that without you making it about baby ducklings, really.
I wasn't making it. It's a literal thing that I've gone through the experience of understanding, learning that we have emotional connections and family bonds like animals do. And when you go through the loss of one being murdered by gunpoint, it's a whole different level and layer of understanding the ethics.
Brought a lot to your reading, because
I've read your words in here, and I read how particular you are and your affection for animals, for your dog, for the moments that you do have with these animals. I understand it, but I just don't think the act of killing them is necessary.
You've
in the
made
way
that clear.
All right.
I am a fiercely mortal being. I'm going to die. We're all going to die. And I am involved in the death of animals. I'm aware of that. And so are you. Because you landed on a runway at LAX today that is many thousands of square acres of land that is no longer used by animals that were extirpated and killed so that you could land on an airplane on there. I mean, we can go down this road if you want, and it's too late to do that. Mm-hmm. But it is so disingenuous to argue that because you don't eat meat anymore, that suddenly you're not responsible for the death of animals.
I never said that.
We're all responsible for the death of animals. I'm just being honest about it.
Yeah.
And I'm being honest about my own mortality, because I knew that after going through my trauma, what I needed to be in touch with was my finitude and my mortality. I needed to stop looking up and out for some rescue. I needed to start living in the world as it actually is.
The hunter claims he just needed to start accepting the world as it is. And this is why he hunts. It's just the way of the world, okay? can't change it. But if everyone thought like that, nothing would ever change. And I don't think he even believes what he said here. Earlier in this podcast, the hunter proudly talked about being one of the first people in the church community to accept LGBT people into his church. He says he had a lot of backlash for that and lost a lot of support. So he's willing to fight for change when it suits him, but when it comes to stopping killing animals, something he clearly enjoys, that's where he draws the line. Real change happens when we challenge ourselves to live by the values we claim to uphold, even if it means we have to give up something that we enjoy for the sake of compassion. Tony the Hunter was so upset at the end of this debate that they brought him back for an extra segment and let him speak for a little bit longer to go over some points that he wanted to make.
I think this strange question of how would Jesus kill an animal? I mean, it's kind of an interesting, like, intellectual exercise, but it's a little bit like asking, how would Jesus drive a car? Or how would Jesus clean a carpet? Or how would Jesus raise children? Or something like that. It's like pure speculation. We don't know anything about that. All we can do, I guess, is try to say that Jesus, most everything Jesus did was in keeping with the culture in which he was living. If Jesus was a part of slaughtering an animal, he would have done it in the very way that the people of his time did. Just like, 100 years ago, your grandma would have gone out back and cut the head off a chicken and brought it in to make dinner. It's not an extraordinary event to do this. And I think Jesus would have done it in normal, unextraordinary ways.
Well, I think people could guess how Jesus might drive a car. They'd probably say he would drive it safely while trying to cause as minimal harm to humans and animals as possible. I don't see why that's so hard to understand. Here's a better question, though. If Jesus were here today and he knows that we can be healthy as vegans, do you think he'd tell you to be healthy as a vegan, or do you think he'd go out there and join you shooting innocent animals and stabbing them in the neck? What would Jesus do? Now, if you couldn't say he'd choose to slit animals' throats with you out in the woods, you're essentially saying that Jesus would pick up a gun, go out into the woods, take shots at innocent animals, stab them, all when he could just eat plant-based instead. And what does that say about your religion? It's not exactly giving off the most peaceful or compassionate vibes, is it?
That passage that he was reading about me butchering a deer, I mean, arguably, it's like one of the emotional high points, the most intense points of the book. And it was just so radically out of context. Like, you have to have read 100 pages of my story to find me finally butchering a deer that I'd hunted and shot. And the emotional and spiritual connection I feel with that animal, and the sacredness with which I approach the butchery of the animal, and the silence and prayer with which I sit with an animal after I've killed it. Like, I'm not a trophy hunter. I'm not a guy who shoots an animal and then high fives all of his buddies and slams a couple bush lights. Like, this is a very, very sacred encounter for me. I take it very, very seriously. And I felt like when he read that passage, it was so ungenerous, and like he was using it as a gotcha, throwing it back in my face. And that's what shocked. I mean, my own emotion kind of shocked me actually in that moment of the debate, because but it hurt. That passage out of context does not make sense.
What is there to make sense of? You described in vivid detail how you like to kill and mutilate animals. You claimed it helps you with your trauma, that it helps you to feel good about yourself and your place in the world. What more context is needed? The violent passages that Kameron read from your book read more like something that Jeffrey Dahmer would write. It's definitely not something you'd expect from a Christian, let alone a reverend. Maybe that's why you got so worked up. The hunter also mentions how he doesn't go and celebrate with his buddies with a beer after he kills an animal, and actually instead he sits down and prays with the animal. But let's be clear, both are violent, cult-like behaviors. Whether you're cracking open a beer or sitting by the dead animal's body murmuring prayers while rocking or whatever you do, it's all just part of trying to soothe your guilt after violently taking an animal's life for your own pleasure. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is about satisfying your desires at the expense of innocent animals. That's enough of Tony the Hunter. let's bring in Kameron the vegan for some final thoughts on this heated debate. We've got Kameron Waters here on the channel now for an exclusive post-debate interview. Cam, how you doing, mate?
I'm doing great, feeling great about it all.
So first things first, the obvious question, who won the debate?
You know, is it really about who wins or loses? I mean, at the end of the day, I think that it's just a win that this conversation is even happening.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Does it annoy you at all that he got to come back and speak behind your back and carry on answering questions, get the last word?
It's fine. You know, he, in the end of the interview, accused me of wanting to have the last word, which I didn't. I was actually just trying to commend him out of respect and tell him about how much I do respect him as a person and that it wasn't a personal attack at the end there. But you know, it's fair enough. He, you know, it's kind of, it doesn't even show it in the footage, but he actually left very quickly after that. And we really couldn't even get a handshake in and all that. So it's, you know, it's good that he got to say some last pieces. I'm fine with it.
So he only answered the question, how would Jesus kill an animal, after the debate had ended, right? And his answer was that basically it's a meaningless question anyway, but he thinks Jesus would have killed animals just like everybody else. What do you make of that answer?
Well, you actually said it really well. One time I watched on one of your streams where it's like, hey, so Jesus is just an average person. He's just going to do it like everybody else does. I don't know that that's the answer at all. No, but I think ultimately I understand why he and some people get frustrated with that question and try to divert and not answer by just saying, hey, what does it even matter is kind of the what he's saying. But I think it does matter, because I think that whether you believe in Jesus or not, everybody kind of agrees that it's the archetypical compassionate person, the most compassionate way to do something. And so I think it's a really important device in exercise to really think about.
Two of the points that you didn't get a chance to answer to that I'm curious to get your thoughts on now. There was one when he claimed that you don't kill any animals with your lifestyle. And that's wrong because someone built an airport and you used it. So that was the one you didn't get a chance to respond to. And the second one that you didn't get a chance to respond to was that he claimed or accused you of condemning poor people around the world because they kill animals to survive, and you're condemning them. So here's your chance to respond. First of all, did they build an airport for you, Cam?
No, he landed on the same airport that I did that morning.
So what about that claim then? The claim that he accused you of saying that your lifestyle kills no animals whatsoever. That's what he accused you of claiming, but you didn't claim that, right?
Yeah, no, I didn't claim that. I'm well aware that there's all kinds of activities and things that we do in the modern world that does inadvertently lead to the death of other beings that I honestly wish didn't happen. And I think in every respect and every way, the more that we can reduce that, the better. But all of this is like unintentional, whereas literally, you know, killing and slaughtering an animal to eat it is an intentional act that, if it's not necessary, seems like the easiest, lowest hanging fruit to minimize suffering. You know, avoiding flying or trying to make the airport have best practices with how it laid its concrete 60 years ago is maybe not the easiest way to.
Yeah, the existence of an airport doesn't give you a green light to go and shoot animals.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a justification. Yeah.
And then the second point where he was claiming you were condemning poor people around the world because they kill animals to survive, and he was saying that you were saying that was wrong, that they do that. How do you respond to that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I understand that there are certain scenarios where someone is basically in a survival situation, and there's certain, you know, moral flexibility there with what you have to do to be able to survive. I think everybody's aware of that, but we're talking about a very, very small percentage of people. And he and I sitting in a room having a podcast after landing on airports and all of these things aren't those people. So it's irrelevant to even be discussing it in the conversation that we're having. And I'll just add to that too, that, yeah, like I have the utmost respect for, you know, and care for poor people coming from my heritage with, you know, Christianity. That's one of the number one kind of tenets of most Christians, is to feed the poor and look after the hungry and the needy. And, you know, in my journey as a Christian and evolving and understanding what I understand now, I realize that most of that hunger actually to start with is set off by the unsustainable practices of animal agriculture. Like in Africa, there's places where some of these children that I used to sponsor through, you know, Compassion International and these World Hunger Relief organizations, the reason why they don't have access to food is because their lands have been decimated by goat herding and such. So
So why do you think the hunter got so angry and emotional when you read out his own words that he wrote in his own book?
Yeah, that's a wild one. I want to start by saying, actually, just to clear it up in case it wasn't clear, he sent me his book. He mailed it to me and said, "Hey, have a look at this, have a read, so that we can discuss this on the podcast." And I had every intention to discuss it. If you look, I have it all folded up and earmarked and everything. I underlined a bunch of stuff. I spent a long time reading that whole book, but it just never came up. There's a lot of things I want to discuss that didn't necessarily come up, but that one was a main one. And it just totally made sense when he said, finally, I think Jesus would kill an animal the way that I would. I'm like, oh, perfect. He describes how he kills animals. And so it was a genuine moment where I wanted to read that back and just really understand, okay, what about this is Christ-like? And what I think he was saying in all of that is, because he put so much intentionality into it, and he's literally able to describe how the knife is cutting through the flesh, almost in like a sensual kind of way, which is a little bit bizarre. I think that means that he's putting love into it for him, and therefore there's all this connection and love. And on top of that, I do know that he's been through some life traumas and things, and him going into the woods and finding himself through hunting, all that connects is like, hey, you're attacking this sacred part of my life. But my whole point was like, is it really the slicing through flesh that's so sacred, or is it the fact that you went out into the woods and had some camping trips? Like, you can do that without killing an animal. But yeah, it seems that it just struck a nerve. And, honestly, I feel for him. I feel for just as I did myself, when in our film, like I mentioned in the debate, we spoke with a young boy hunter and went with him on a trip where we witnessed what it's like going through that process of killing an animal. And I think something within yourself dies when you do that. And I think that some of that reaction is that inner part of himself, that I know very well, that's like a little bit maybe ashamed, or maybe, knows that it's wrong.
What's the message that you want people to take home from this debate?
So I know the debate was Jesus vegan? And I know that might not even be interesting to most people. And to those that it is interesting, I know this debate went very deep into scripture and a lot of details around scripture. And there's plenty of that. And I could go for days and truly do believe and can stand on the historical record and the scriptures that point in the direction that these peoples 2,000 years ago were doing everything in their power to end animal suffering as a part of their mission. However, what I'd like for people to know is that the point is, whether we can actually prove that or not, the fact that we're even able to have that discussion about these people says a lot, because we're talking about, say Jesus, say he did eat fish, say this is true that he was a fisherman or helped fishermen eat fish. It's very rare in the scripture. There's no evidence of anything else. And the fact that these people are desert dwelling people 2,000 years ago, and they're still just maybe barely eating some fish, but trying their best. And there's record of John the Baptist and Jesus's brother going out of their way to eat fruits and vegetables instead. I think it's pretty clear what the intentions were. And so my whole thing that I'd love for people to walk away is, if they can do that back then, what can we do today when we've got 90 billion land animals being killed every year, 99% of them in factory farms, and that's not even including the trillions of fish. I mean, if Jesus and the disciples were fishing and eat fish, do we think really that it's anything like the fishing industry that we have today, where we're just scooping up the entire ocean basically in one swoop every time that the nets go down? I don't think so. And I don't think that that Christ-like, compassionate, ultimately humane way of doing things would include this type of behavior. So that's what I'd like to leave people with, is like, let's really think deeply about where we are now and make choices accordingly.